Isabella Harrington adjusted the thin gold bracelet on her wrist as she stepped through the heavy glass doors of the Metropolitan, an exclusive downtown bar that catered to tech industry elites. At 36, she had learned the art of calculated invisibility. Her navy dress was elegant but unremarkable, her dark hair pulled into a simple twist that required no second glance. She moved through the world like a whisper, someone people's eyes would skip over without registering why. The bar hummed with the energy of money and ambition. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the glittering cityscape, and crystal chandeliers cast warm light across polished mahogany and leather. This was where deals were made, where fortunes shifted hands over single malt scotch and craft cocktails with names Isabella couldn't pronounce. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She was here to meet James after his panel discussion at the Tech Leaders Summit. The text he'd sent 3 hours ago had been characteristically brief, panel running long. Meet me at the Metropolitan around 8. You'll love it there. Isabella had arrived at 7:30, not because she was eager, but because arriving early meant she could choose her position carefully. She selected a seat at the far end of the bar, near enough to observe, but distant enough to avoid immediate attention. The bartender, a woman in her early 30s with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of a life beyond this polished establishment, noticed her immediately. "What can I get you?" the bartender asked, her name tag reading Elena. "Pinot Noir, please," Isabella said quietly. "Whatever you recommend." Elena's eyes flickered with recognition, not of Isabella's face, but of something else. The way Isabella held herself, perhaps. The careful modulation of her voice. The practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Rough day?" Elena asked as she poured, adding just a bit more than the standard pour. Isabella's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the stem of the glass. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who's looking," Elena replied, her voice low and conspiratorial. She gestured subtly to the crowd. "This place? It's full of people who don't really see anything beyond their own reflection." Isabella allowed herself a small, genuine smile. "Thank you," she said, and meant it for more than just the wine. As Elena moved away to serve other customers, Isabella settled into her familiar role, observer. She watched the power dynamics play out around her with a strategist's eye, cataloging details others missed. The junior executive who laughed too loudly at his superior's jokes. The venture capitalist who checked his watch every 3 minutes, calculating the value of his time. The cluster of women near the window, their designer handbags arranged like territorial markers, their conversation a performance of success. Her phone buzzed. "James, running late. Entertain yourself for an hour." Isabella stared at the message, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest. Entertain yourself. As if she were a child who needed distraction, not his wife who had rearranged her entire evening to be here. She thought about this morning's argument, the one that had started over breakfast and ended in cold silence. She had suggested a strategic pivot for Chun Technologies' new product launch, pointing out vulnerabilities in their current approach that could cost them market share. James had listened with that particular expression he'd perfected over the years, polite attention masking complete dismissal. "That's an interesting thought, Bella," he'd said, already turning back to his laptop. "But the team has this handled. Trust me." Then, during his panel this afternoon, which she'd watched via live stream from their home office, he'd used her exact analysis. Word for word. The moderator had praised his innovative thinking, and James had accepted the compliment with gracious humility, never once mentioning that the insight had come from his wife over scrambled eggs and coffee. Isabella took a long sip of wine, letting the rich, complex flavors ground her in the present moment. She had become an expert at swallowing these small betrayals, at telling herself it didn't matter. Support, she'd learned, was supposed to be invisible. That was its power, wasn't it? The selflessness of it. But lately, the invisibility felt less like virtue and more like erasure. Well, look who decided to grace us with her presence." The voice cut through Isabella's thoughts like a blade wrapped in silk. She didn't need to turn to know who had arrived. Diane Mercer's voice was unmistakable, carefully modulated to project warmth while delivering something else entirely. Isabella turned slowly, her face arranging itself into the pleasant, neutral expression she perfected over 8 years of these events. Diane stood flanked by two other women Isabella recognized from previous gatherings: Patricia Chun, whose husband ran a competing tech firm, and Melissa Zhao, married to one of James's board members. All three women wore power like armor. Designer dresses that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Jewelry that caught the light with deliberate sparkle. Hair styled to look effortlessly perfect in a way that required significant effort and expense. Diane, Isabella said, her voice even. Patricia, Melissa, it's nice to see you all. Oh, we were just saying how nice it was that James brings you to these things, Diane continued, moving closer. She positioned herself at the bar, close enough that anyone watching would think this was a friendly conversation. So many men leave their wives at home. But James is different. He likes to include you. The words landed exactly as intended. Include you. As if Isabella were a charitable act, a kindness extended rather than an equal partner. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Most women would be bored at these industry events, Patricia added, signaling Elena for a cosmopolitan. All that business talk. It's sweet that you come along to support him, though. That's what marriage is about, isn't it? Supporting your husband's success. Isabella's grip on her wine glass tightened infinitesimally. She noticed Elena watching from behind the bar, her expression unreadable but her attention focused. I find the business talk quite interesting, actually, Isabella said quietly. Melissa laughed, a bright, tinkling sound that carried just far enough. Oh, Isabella, you're so modest. I'm sure you understand some of it. But it must be overwhelming without the background. I remember when Marcus and I first married, I had no idea what he was talking about half the time. But you learn to smile and nod, don't you? Poor thing must be exhausted just waiting around. Diane stage whispered to her companions, loud enough for Isabella to hear every word. I don't know how she fills her days. I'd go mad without my charity work and board positions. Some women are content with a quieter life, Patricia said, her tone dripping with false sympathy. Not everyone needs to be in the spotlight. There's dignity in being a supportive partner. The conversation continued around her, each comment carefully crafted to sound like concern while delivering something much sharper. Isabella had experienced this particular form of cruelty dozens of times over the years. It was an art form, really. The ability to diminish someone while maintaining plausible deniability. If called out, Diane would be shocked, offended even. I was complimenting her devotion to her marriage. Why are you being so sensitive? Isabella took another sip of wine, her mind cataloging details despite the anger simmering beneath her careful composure. Diane's left hand trembled slightly, a tell Isabella had noticed before. Insecurity masked as superiority. Patricia's smile never reached her eyes, and she checked her phone compulsively, as if afraid of missing something more important. Melissa's perfection was exhausting to maintain. You could see it in the tightness around her mouth, the way she constantly adjusted her dress, her hair, her position. These women built their identities on being more than just wives. But their cruelty revealed how threatened they felt by anyone who didn't perform the same frantic dance of relevance. Elena appeared at Isabella's elbow, replacing her wine glass with a fresh pour despite it being only half empty. Their eyes met briefly, and Isabella saw understanding there. Witness. Someone who saw what was happening and recognized it for what it was. Thank you, Isabella murmured. Anytime, Elena replied, her voice carrying a weight that suggested she meant it. Isabella's phone buzzed again. She glanced down, expecting another delay from James. Instead, it was Sophie Kim, her best friend and former colleague from another lifetime. Sophie, how's the event? Remember, you don't have to shrink yourself for anyone. You're brilliant, even if they can't see it. The message landed with unexpected force, bringing tears Isabella couldn't allow herself to shed. She blinked them back, typing a quick response, hanging in there. The usual. Sophie's reply came immediately. The usual bullshit, you mean? Want me to come down there and cause a scene? Despite everything, Isabella smiled. Sophie was one of the few people who knew who Isabella had been before she became James's wife. One of the few who still called her by the nickname she'd earned in her consulting days, back when she was Isabella Park, the youngest partner at Stratford and Associates, the woman they called the Oracle. That felt like another lifetime now. Another person entirely. Isabella ordered another drink, her facade of calm beginning to crack along invisible fault lines. She checked her watch. 8:47. James was now 47 minutes late to meet her, and she was trapped in this gilded cage of false pleasantries and veiled insults. The bar continued its symphony around her. Laughter and deal-making, networking and negotiation. She was surrounded by people, yet profoundly alone. The bartender's tired eyes, the predatory glances of men assessing women as assets or obstacles, Diane's performance of concern that masked contempt, the insincerity that hung in the air like expensive perfume. Isabella had become background noise in her own life. Elevator music, present but unheard, visible but unseen. She thought about leaving, simply standing up and walking out, taking a car home, pouring herself a real drink, and spending the evening in her home office where she did the work James didn't know about. Or perhaps he did know. On some level he refused to acknowledge. But she stayed, because that's what she did. She stayed, and smiled, and swallowed the small humiliations that accumulated like compound interest on a debt she'd never agreed to pay. At 9:15, the energy in the bar shifted. Isabella felt it before she saw it, a change in the atmospheric pressure that made her look toward the entrance. James had arrived. He moved through the crowd like someone accustomed to doors opening for him, which they literally did. Tall and handsome in his tailored suit, his dark hair styled perfectly despite the late hour, his smile warm and confident as he greeted people he knew. He was magnetic in the way successful people often were, drawing attention simply by existing in a space. Behind him came David Mercer, Diane's husband and James's CFO, along with two other executives Isabella recognized from company events. They were deep in conversation, the kind of animated discussion that signaled deals and decisions, the machinery of business grinding forward. James spotted her finally, his eyes scanning the bar before landing on her position at the far end. His face softened with what looked like genuine affection, and for a moment, Isabella remembered why she'd fallen in love with him. In private moments, when it was just the two of them, he could still be the man she'd met 10 years ago. Vulnerable, ambitious, yes, but also kind. Present. But this wasn't a private moment. "Hey, babe," James said, arriving at her side and placing a distracted kiss on her cheek. "Sorry I'm late." The panel ran over, and then everyone wanted to continue the discussion. "You know how it is." He said it casually, assuming she understood, assuming she didn't mind, assuming her time was infinitely flexible and infinitely less valuable than his. "It's fine," Isabella said automatically, the words emerging before she could consider whether they were true. James had already turned to David and the others, continuing their conversation as if Isabella were furniture. Expensive furniture he was proud to own but didn't need to actively engage with. "Isabella, you look comfortable," James said over his shoulder, a throwaway comment that landed with more impact than he realized. "We're just going to grab that table over there. David wants to discuss the third quarter projections." Comfortable. As if she were here to be comfortable rather than to be with him. As if this were a lobby she was waiting in rather than an evening she'd been promised. Diane materialized at her husband's elbow, her expression shifting seamlessly from contempt to admiration. "James, the panel was incredible. You were so insightful about the market positioning. Where do you come up with these strategies?" Isabella's jaw tightened. She watched James accept the compliment with gracious humility, explaining his process for strategic thinking. The process that began with Isabella's analysis and ended with James's presentation, her fingerprints carefully erased from every brilliant idea. "It's all about seeing patterns others miss," James said, and Isabella heard her own words echoed back in his voice. "Understanding not just where the market is, but where it's going to be." The Oracle. That's what they'd called her, back when she was the one seeing patterns. Back when her insights were valuable enough to command 6 figures per consultation. Back when she had her own identity beyond supportive wife. "Excuse me," Isabella said quietly, standing. "I need to use the restroom." No one seemed to notice her departure except Elena, who caught her eye and nodded slightly, a small gesture of solidarity between women who understood different flavors of invisibility. The bathroom was a sanctuary of marble and flattering light. Isabella stood at the sink, gripping the cool edge, staring at her reflection. The woman looking back at her was tired in ways that had nothing to do with sleep. There was a weariness in her eyes that came from years of making herself smaller, quieter, less. She thought about Sophie's text. You don't have to shrink yourself. But wasn't that exactly what love required sometimes? Sacrifice? Compromise? Supporting your partner's dreams, even when it meant postponing your own? Except somewhere along the way, postponing had become abandoning. Supporting had become erasing. And Isabella couldn't remember the last time James had asked about her dreams at all. Her phone buzzed. Sophie again. You still breathing? Isabella smiled despite herself. Barely. Get out of there. Come have real drinks with someone who actually appreciates you. Isabella considered it. She really did. But instead, she straightened her dress, refreshed her lipstick, and prepared to return to the performance. Because that's what she did. She performed the role of supportive wife, understanding partner, woman content with reflection rather than her own light. When she emerged from the bathroom, she found that James and his group had moved to a larger table near the windows. The seating had already been arranged, conversations already flowing. There was a chair for her, but it was positioned slightly apart, not quite part of the circle. A literal and metaphorical margin. As Isabella approached, she noticed a new arrival at the table. A man she didn't immediately recognize, but whose presence commanded attention. He was in his mid-40s, tall and lean, with steel-gray hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog everything they encountered. Those eyes landed on Isabella, and something flickered in them. Recognition? Curiosity? She couldn't quite place it, but it made her deeply uncomfortable. Because Isabella Harrington had spent the last 8 years ensuring that no one from her former life ever encountered her current one. She'd changed her last name, obviously. She'd avoided industry events, declined speaking invitations, turned down consulting requests. She'd built walls between Isabella Park, the Oracle, and Isabella Harrington, supportive wife. But walls, she was learning, were never as solid as you hoped. The man stood as she approached, a gesture of old-fashioned courtesy that seemed out of place in this modern setting. James noticed finally, turning to include her in the conversation. Oh, Isabella, perfect timing, James said. This is Marcus Holloway. Marcus, my wife, Isabella. Marcus extended his hand, and when Isabella took it, his grip was firm and brief. Professional. But his eyes held hers for a beat longer than necessary, searching. It's a pleasure to meet you, Marcus said, his voice carrying a weight that suggested he meant something more than the conventional greeting. Likewise, Isabella managed, her heart rate accelerating in a way she couldn't control. She knew that name, Marcus Holloway, and if she knew his name, there was a very good chance he might know hers. Or at least, the name she'd used before. Isabella sat in the chair that had been left for her, slightly apart from the group, and tried to calm her breathing. This was fine. She'd changed. It had been 15 years. There was no reason to panic. But as the conversation flowed around her, as James held court discussing quarterly projections and market share and strategic initiatives, Isabella felt Marcus Holloway's attention return to her again and again. Not obviously, not in a way that drew comment, but she felt it nonetheless, the weight of his gaze, the analytical assessment of someone trying to solve a puzzle. The wine in her glass seemed to evaporate, though she didn't remember drinking it. Elena appeared with a refill, her presence brief but reassuring. You doing okay? Elena asked quietly, just for Isabella. I honestly don't know anymore, Isabella admitted. Elena squeezed her shoulder briefly, a gesture of support that was more meaningful than she could possibly know. Then she was gone, returning to her station behind the bar, watching over her domain with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to read danger in the smallest gestures. Isabella sipped her wine and tried to disappear into the background again. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to shift, that the careful equilibrium she'd maintained for 8 years was beginning to destabilize, and that Marcus Holloway, whoever he was and whatever he remembered, was going to be the catalyst. At the industry dinner, Isabella sat quietly as her husband, James, dominated the conversation with his strategic genius. Every idea he presented, every insight, was hers, repackaged under his name. She'd long mastered invisibility, present but unseen. But Marcus Holloway, a powerful CEO, kept watching her with unsettling recognition. When he finally spoke to her, his questions revealed he knew her past. She'd once been the Oracle, a prodigy strategist who saved his company 15 years earlier under the name Isabella Park. Now, hidden behind her married name, she'd become the ghost supporting her husband's success. Marcus reminded her of the legacy she'd buried, her work taught in business schools as the Holloway turnaround. His words cracked her composure. Later, when James dismissed her offer to fix a multi-million-dollar crisis, something inside her snapped. Diane's condescension triggered the final break. Isabella stood and revealed the truth. She had an MBA from Stanford, had saved Fortune 500 companies, and had written every major strategy her husband claimed as his own. The room fell silent. Marcus confirmed her story. Others realized who she was. At last, Isabella stopped shrinking. Yes, she told a young journalist, voice steady. It's time to tell the truth. The bar buzzed with revelation. Isabella Harrington was no mere wife. She was Isabella Park, the Oracle, a legend who'd vanished 15 years ago. Marcus Holloway, Grace Wellington, Elena, and journalist Yuki Tanaka gathered as Isabella broke her silence. She explained how she'd once saved James's startup with her strategies, how love had slowly become erasure. Success changed him, she said. I stopped being Isabella Park and became just his wife. For years, she'd secretly written strategies under an alias, IP Consulting, saving James's company without his knowledge. When confronted, a stunned colleague confirmed her authorship of reports predicting the very crisis unfolding that night. Diane scoffed, but proof silenced her. Grace, battle-hardened and wise, told Isabella she hadn't failed. She'd been erased by a world too comfortable with brilliant women disappearing. Then James called, asking for her help just to talk things through, unaware she was the strategist he relied on. Isabella realized love had become exploitation disguised as partnership. I need to face him, she said, standing tall. Sophie arrived, offering backup, but Isabella refused. I have to do this alone. As she left, the others watched in awe. The Oracle hadn't vanished. She'd been reborn. Isabella parked in silence outside the sleek modern house she'd designed but never been credited for. Sophie offered to go in with her, but Isabella shook her head. I need to do this myself. Inside, James was on the phone, commanding his team to fix the European crisis, using a strategy she'd written and he'd ignored. This time, Isabella didn't stay quiet. She walked in. We need to talk. James looked up, distracted. Can it wait? No. Do you know who I am? Her words stopped him cold. Then she told him everything. That she was Isabella Park, the Oracle, a former top strategist who'd saved corporations and disappeared into a shadow. That IP Consulting, the mysterious strategist he relied on, was her. When he saw the proof, emails, analyses, years of her work, his face drained. Why would you hide this? Because you stopped hearing me as your wife. But you listened to a stranger. He pleaded, we can fix this. No, she said softly. You'd have to share the credit, and I don't think your ego can. She packed her bag. I'm leaving, James. I need to be seen again. And as she walked out into the night, she stopped being invisible. 3 months later, Isabella Harrington is reborn. She's taken Marcus Holloway's offer and commands a new team, credited, visible, and celebrated. Headlines call it the Oracle Returns. Her apartment is small, but hers alone, filled with color and warmth. Her laughter, once hesitant, returns freely over dinner with Sophie. Meanwhile, James's empire falters. Deals unravel. The board questions his judgment. For the first time, he feels the absence of her unseen brilliance. Therapy becomes his routine, humility, his curriculum. Richard visits Isabella, but doesn't push reconciliation. He's learning, he says. But that's for him, not for you. Then Yuki's article goes viral. The Oracle Returns. One woman's story of erasure and reclamation. Isabella's interview follows, measured, honest. I don't regret loving him. I regret losing myself. James sends an email, not begging, but acknowledging every theft of credit, every silenced idea. I finally see it, he writes. Diane's attempt to discredit Isabella collapses when Grace Wellington publishes an op-ed dismantling her cruelty. Isabella reads it with quiet satisfaction. When a consulting request from James's company arrives, she hesitates. Proof that freedom isn't just about leaving, but about choosing who you'll be when asked to return. Isabella studies the consulting contract lying on her kitchen table. Sophie warns, you don't owe them your brilliance again. Marcus adds, Just make sure you're doing it for you. She meets James at a quiet cafe, neutral ground. He looks older, softer. I thought I needed you small so I could be big, he admits. But your light never dimmed mine. My insecurity did. For the first time, she feels seen, but hearing isn't enough. If I save your company, she asks, do I disappear again? No, James says. I don't want you to save the company. I want to know if there's a way to save us. Isabella decides. She'll take the contract, but on her terms, full credit, full pay, public acknowledgement. She's not coming home, but she's willing to try therapy. 6 months later, at her book launch, The Oracle's Return, James sits in the audience, silent and proud. Her dedication reads, to everyone who's been told they're just anything, you're not. The final scene, Isabella's speaking to a crowd. I used to be called the Oracle. Then I became invisible. This is how I found myself again, and why none of us should have to disappear to be loved. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.